Zephyra O'Neal was told to serve the coffee. 10 minutes later, she was rewriting the company's future. Behind every billion-dollar empire lies a lie, and she just uncovered it. The board thought she was too young, too bold, too black to lead. But what they didn't know, she came to take the throne they built to keep her out. Power doesn't ask permission, it reclaims its seat. This is the story they tried to silence. Now it's brewing loud. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. She walked into the boardroom like she belonged, but they saw a shadow, not a storm. They called him Big Shaq, a nickname heavy with charisma, fame, and the echo of sold-out arenas. But in retirement, Shaquille O'Neal wore something heavier than championship rings. The burden of representation. The gravity of being a symbol. Not just a man who made it, but the man they all pointed to when asked, "What more do you people want?" A legend. A legacy. A loophole they used to dodge accountability. He never let it show, not in public. Not even to the cameras that still followed him in grocery aisles or charity drives. But at home, behind quiet walls built not with marble but with intention, he was simply a father. And being a father to Zephyra O'Neal required more than patience. It required armor. Zephyra wasn't loud, but her mind was volcanic. She moved through rooms like jazz, smooth, unpredictable, impossible to pin down. She didn't inherit Shaq's height, but she inherited his presence. Still, presence alone couldn't shield her, especially not in a world where boardrooms measured worth by whiteness and compliance. She graduated top of her class from Duke, interned at black-owned VC firms, turned down offers from hedge funds that looked too much like plantations in Prada. Shaq watched her with pride, but he also watched her with dread, because brilliance in a black woman was a target in disguise, and the higher she climbed, the more invisible her wings became to those in power. Shaquille's mansion in Atlanta wasn't the kind that screamed money. It whispered legacy. Walls lined with awards but also family photos. Zephyra at 5, grinning in oversized sneakers. Lucille, his mother, holding a gospel cookbook and a judgmental stare. Shawnee, his ex-wife, still co-parenting like a general in war, loyal to the cause even when the marriage dissolved. On a late Tuesday morning, Zephyra sipped lemon water in the sunroom. "Dad," she said without lifting her gaze from her laptop, "if I play it too safe, I vanish. If I push too hard, I'm aggressive. If I smile too much, I'm fake. If I don't smile, I'm angry. So how do I win?" Shaq leaned on the doorway, arms folded across his chest, watching his daughter stare into the digital abyss of a corporate structure she was preparing to step into. "You don't play to win," he said. "You play so well they have to rewrite the rules." But what he didn't say, what he couldn't say, was this. Even when you break their rules, they move the goalposts. That afternoon, she flew to San Francisco. Not for a job, but for a position with potential to become more than a title. The company was called Virexion, a sleek trillion-dollar tech firm disguised as a startup with innovation slogans and carefully staged diversity posters. They'd offered her a fast-track rotational placement, but she knew better. It wasn't fast-track, it was watch and see. They wanted her brilliance, but not her voice. They wanted the daughter of Big Shaq, not Zephyra the strategist. At the welcome orientation, she walked through the glass doors in a power blue blazer, natural curls pinned back, heels clicking like statements. The receptionist didn't look up. An older white man in a navy suit nodded at her, then leaned toward his assistant and whispered, "Make sure she gets the coffee orders." She heard it. She didn't flinch. She walked into the boardroom like she belonged, but they saw a shadow, not a storm. Inside, 12 executives talked over each other in buzzwords. A white woman in a leopard print scarf motioned toward Zephyra without breaking stride. "We need coffee refills, thank you." Zephyra paused. No panic, no smirk, just a nod, and she walked out. She didn't argue. She didn't correct them. She observed. She learned. Because empires aren't built in tantrums, they're built in strategy. In the hallway, she pulled out her phone and typed notes. Mistaken for assistant. Tested under assumptions. Document behavior. Then she tapped the camera and recorded her thoughts aloud. Not for evidence, but for clarity. For herself. Shaq, back home, watched her first day Instagram post. Just a skyline shot with the caption, "Step 1. Breathe fire slowly." He knew she had inherited the family's gift, but he also knew fire alone wouldn't protect her from systemic frostbite. Over the next week, Zephyra rotated through 3 departments. In each one she delivered results, but got labeled overconfident. She presented data that doubled projected growth, and got told her tone needed softening. In a private meeting, a junior exec pulled her aside and said, "You're intimidating, in a good way of course." She smiled. But it wasn't a smile of acceptance. It was a note-to-self smile. A clock's-ticking smile. At night, she journaled. She didn't ask for advice. She didn't vent. She built her case. Because while others saw her as decoration, she saw them as liabilities. The kind that brought companies down in quarterly scandals. Back in Atlanta, Shaq took meetings with investors, dodging corporate speak, sipping tea with community organizers instead. He donated millions quietly, built schools in his mother's name, and refused to speak at events that used him as window dressing for performative inclusion. He saw through it all, the way the same hands that applauded his success also built ceilings for his daughter. One night, he received a call from a silent number. When he picked up, the voice was clear and clipped. "Mr. O'Neal, are you aware your daughter is attempting to secure a seat on the Virexion Investment Advisory Board?" He paused. "She's a grown woman. Is there a problem?" The voice coughed politely. "Let's just say, some people feel it would be a conflict of interest, given her relation to you. Optics matter." Shaq hung up without a word. That was the moment he knew. They weren't just afraid of Zephyra's ambition. They were afraid of her becoming undeniable. And when institutions are afraid, they sanitize, then sabotage. But what they didn't understand was that Zephyra hadn't come to be liked. She came to own the system that misread her from the lobby to the top floor. Because for Zephyra, the power wasn't in the smile. It was in the silence behind it. The silence that watched, that listened, that built. And when the time came, it would be the silence that spoke the loudest. The tray trembled in her hands, but not from fear, from fury restrained like a hurricane in a teacup. On the 24th floor of Virexion's headquarters, glass walls gleamed like arrogance polished to a shine. The entire floor pulsed with productivity, but beneath that surface beat a quieter rhythm, one of performance, surveillance, and hierarchy. It was not just an office, it was a theater of power, and Zephyra O'Neal had stepped onto that stage with her eyes wide open. She arrived early, not to impress but to observe. The receptionist greeted her as if she were another vendor, pointing toward a side elevator used mostly by couriers and assistants. Zephyra didn't argue. She took the longer hallway instead, walking past frosted glass doors with titles that hinted at influence. Innovation Lead, Chief Strategy Officer, VP, Partnerships. Each door a nameplate. Each nameplate a pattern, sleek serif fonts, spelling out legacy, nepotism, and whiteness in disguise. No one questioned her presence directly, but they did what institutions have mastered, the language of lesser than spoken without words. It was in the way glances passed over her, never landing. The way an exec passed her in the break room and muttered, "Oh, you're new. Welcome. The latte machine's over there. I take mine with oat milk." He said it with a half smile, expecting gratitude. Zephyra's lips curved, but her mind moved faster than her expression. This wasn't her first encounter with soft-edged dismissal. What they didn't realize was that each interaction sharpened her awareness, made her quieter, sharper, more exact. She documented it all in mental bullet points. She had been assigned to shadow the operations director, a man named Travis Calhoun whose resume read like an internship in privilege. He ran meetings like a high school coach, clapping between slides, talking in metaphors about scaling Everest and catching whales. He referred to the executive team as family, and the janitorial staff as support heroes, always said with that tone that made their inclusion feel performative. In the midday meeting, the room filled with tailored suits and curated smiles, Travis was setting up his tablet when he waved in her direction without looking.
"Hey, you mind grabbing coffee for everyone?"
He asked, like it was a favor. "Just grab a tray. Cream and sugar on the side. Thanks, sweetheart." The tray trembled in her hands, but not from fear, from fury restrained like a hurricane in a teacup. Every fiber of her being wanted to pause and ask, "What made you think I was here to serve you?" But she didn't. Because silence, when weaponized with precision, speaks volumes in rooms too noisy to hear honesty. She returned with the coffee, perfectly poured, steaming, balanced. Not one drop spilled. She laid the tray down like a dealer placing cards at a high-stakes table. She caught the eyes of the woman in HR, who'd smiled too hard during orientation. The woman blinked, confused, then looked away. Throughout the meeting, they talked about diverse recruitment and targeting untapped markets, while ignoring the only person in the room who represented either. Zephyra took notes, not of the slides, but of the subtext. Every offhand comment, every coded phrase, every decision that prioritized familiarity over innovation. After the meeting, Travis clapped her on the back, a little too hard. "Appreciate the hustle," he said. "That's the kind of initiative that gets noticed around here." She smiled just enough. Back in the elevator, she pressed the button for the executive wing. The other interns looked startled. One, a young white guy named Brett whispered, You sure you're cleared for that level? She didn't answer. The door closed. Inside the glass box, her reflection stared back at her. Calm, poised, but the wheels in her head turned like gears in a silent revolution. She had no interest in fitting into a hierarchy built to exclude her. She came to document its fault lines and prepare for the shift. What they didn't know, what made this even more dangerous, was that Zephyra wasn't just some overachieving entry-level recruit. She was the daughter of a man who had shares in this very company, a silent stakeholder. Shaquille O'Neal had invested years ago, kept quiet, and observed. He didn't pull strings. He wanted her to build her own legacy, but he also wanted her to know the power was there if she needed it. Later that afternoon, in a one-on-one with the director of people and culture, a thin woman with a PhD and a Pinterest smile, Zephyra listened as the director explained how the company was working on inclusion. You know, the director said, sipping from her reusable straw, we're actually hoping to launch a podcast where women of color in tech can share their experience. Maybe you could join that. Zephyra tilted her head slightly. Sounds like a great post-initiative, after actual inclusion. The woman blinked, caught off guard. I beg your pardon? Zephyra leaned forward, calm. Narratives are fine, but what's your executive hiring policy? Your equity vesting strategy? How many department heads are people of color? And who on the board knows what a microaggression looks like without Googling it first? The silence was exquisite. She walked out without waiting for a reply. The next morning, the rumor started that she was difficult, that she spoke too directly, that she had an attitude. It reached Travis by lunch. He mentioned it casually as he passed her cubicle. Just be careful. The higher-ups are watching. Better to play the long game, you know? She knew exactly what game they were playing, and she wasn't playing it. She was redesigning the board. The day ended with her back in the executive wing, walking past doors she wasn't supposed to open. She stood outside a room marked strategic governance. Inside, a meeting buzzed about a potential acquisition, a billion-dollar pivot in the works. Her eyes caught the names on the roster. All familiar, all powerful, all white. She turned to leave, but paused. On the bulletin board nearby, a printed copy of Virexian's value statement hung in gold lettering. Diversity, equity, innovation, empathy, words framed like artifacts. Preserved, untouched, unlived. She pulled out her phone, took a picture, captioned it privately, "Welcome to the Museum of Promises." Back home that night, Shaq was watching old game footage. Not of himself, but of Zephyra, aged 9, giving a school speech about Ida B. Wells. His daughter had always stood in rooms too small for her spirit, but now she was in a building where her spirit wasn't just too big, it was considered a threat. He texted her, "Keep your back straight. Your name's louder than their titles." She replied with a single emoji.
A hurricane.
The next morning, someone placed a sticky note on her desk. Conference room A. Coffee needed. Thanks. She picked it up, read it once, then calmly walked to the kitchen, brewed a pot, poured 2 cups. She carried the tray to the room. And this time she didn't leave. She sat at the table, in the chair at the head. They looked up, puzzled. She placed 1 cup in front of herself, the other in the center of the table. No explanation, just presence. And then she said quietly but clearly, "You might want to drink up. Things are about to change." He built an empire brick by brick. Now they want to paint him as a mascot in his own palace. Shaquille O'Neal didn't believe in legacy as decoration. For him it had weight, not just in his name but in what it represented. Sweat-earned credibility, grounded wisdom, and a refusal to be anyone's symbol unless it meant something. So when the Virexian board called and asked if he'd consider doing a commercial spot for their new equity and tech initiative, he didn't laugh. He just stared at the phone for a full minute before saying, "Send the paperwork," and hanging up. He knew what they were doing. Trying to slap his name and face on a structure built to exclude people who looked like him. And more importantly, people who looked like Zephyra. They didn't want his ideas. They wanted his glow. A safe, smiling giant. A softened legend who made them feel progressive just by proximity. But Big Shaq didn't wear chains. Not on his neck, not on his spirit, and certainly not in the boardroom. 3 weeks earlier, he'd quietly increased his stake in Virexian, through a shell trust, giving him more power than anyone realized. He didn't do it for clout. He did it to keep eyes on the pulse. Because things inside the company had been shifting. Not on the surface, not in their PR slogans or tech rollouts, but in the way decisions were made, policies rewritten, voices disappeared. And now with Zephyra walking among those halls, Shaq felt the weight double on his shoulders. They wanted to decorate the palace with him, but he built his name brick by brick. He knew the walls well. He knew where they creaked. That morning, he sat with Zephyra in the breakfast nook of his Atlanta home. The room smelled of citrus and ground cinnamon. The sun filtered through stained glass panels, casting fractured rainbows on the floor. It was peaceful, but the conversation wasn't. Zephyra leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes sharp. They're not threatened by what I say. They're threatened by the fact that I don't ask permission to say it. Shaq stirred his coffee slowly. You sure they know who you are? I think they know enough to pretend they don't, she said, voice dry. He nodded. That's the kind of threat they can't measure, but it's the most real. Then he pulled a leather folder from beneath the table and slid it across to her. Inside were documents, old acquisition proposals, private investor memos, and one particular report that stopped her breath cold. A market expansion initiative labeled North Block Project, buried under 5 layers of corporate jargon. But the numbers told a clear story. Defunding initiatives in black majority cities, rerouting funds toward future-proof developments in safer, wealthier zones, all while keeping the optics intact through public diversity campaigns. Zephyra read the numbers twice. Her jaw tensed. They've been gutting minority-led initiatives for 5 quarters straight, then calling it market correction. Shaq leaned back. And I've been voting no at every meeting, but my votes are getting buried. You think someone's altering records? I think someone's using me to keep the image clean while they cut the roots. That's when she noticed a pattern. The name E. Langford appeared frequently on sign-off reports. Elliot Langford, the current board chair. The same man who once told a journalist that Shaq was proof that progress was possible if you worked hard and stayed positive. A quote that made headlines and made Shaq's stomach turn. Elliot had built his career on being tolerantly racist, the kind who smiled in front of cameras and rewrote exclusion as strategy. Shaq had never trusted him. Now he had the proof to back that instinct. You think Elliot's orchestrating this? Zephyra asked.
I think Elliot's scared, Shaq said, and when people like him get scared, they start using allies like props.
That night, Zephyra didn't sleep. She sat at her apartment desk, spreadsheets spread around her like a battlefield. Patterns emerged. Board vote inconsistencies, resource reallocation with missing timestamps, programs that were greenlit and then quietly disappeared from records. And one common thread, Langford's final approval. But it wasn't just data. She saw a bigger picture. A system designed to elevate people like her, only when it served the image, not the mission. A system that made space without giving power. She remembered the coffee tray, the backhanded smiles, the podcast invitation, every small gesture that now looked like part of a coordinated containment strategy. The next day, she flew back to LA, where the quarterly board gathering was taking place. She wasn't scheduled to speak, but she didn't need a microphone to be heard. She stepped into the back of the ballroom just as the meeting began. Floor-to-ceiling windows glared sunlight onto polished tables. The smell of filtered air and catered silence filled the space. Shaq was already seated, his expression unreadable. Langford stood at the front, sleeves rolled like a startup founder, though his hands had never built a thing. He was selling the room on a new community initiative, Tech for All, a grant series meant to support minority-owned startups. Words like equality, empowerment, and bridging the gap floated in the air like expensive perfume. Zephyra watched from the shadows. She didn't need to speak yet. She needed to listen, confirm what she already knew. Langford clicked through slides that painted the company as a pioneer of equity. Not one of the projects listed had ever been funded beyond the pilot phase. She knew, because she'd already done the math. Then Langford called Shaq by name. We're lucky, he said, gesturing toward him, to have the heart of this mission sitting at this very table. Shaquille O'Neal has been our compass, our symbol of what can happen when business and humanity work together. Shaq didn't flinch, but his jaw shifted ever so slightly. Zephyra stepped forward, just enough to be seen, but not enough to interrupt. Not yet. Langford smiled wider, turning toward Shaq. Would you like to say a few words? Shaq stood slowly, his shadow stretched across the table, long and deliberate. I'll say this, he began. A symbol without substance is just decoration, and I didn't come here to be furniture. The room held its breath. He turned toward Langford. You want to talk about empowerment? Let's start with truth. How many of these initiatives you're pitching have full funding beyond Q1? How many have diverse teams actually running them? And how many of your leadership pipeline programs lead to real promotions? Langford's smile faltered. Shaq stepped forward. Because I've seen the reports, the cuts, the redirections. You think you can wrap that in buzzwords and call it progress? That's not strategy, that's sabotage. Silence rolled across the room like thunder without rain. Zephyra remained in the back, watching. This wasn't her moment to speak. It was her moment to measure. The tremors had begun. The ground was starting to shift. And when power starts to panic, the truth begins to surface. Outside, the sky darkened slightly, clouds inching across the sun. Inside, the temperature held steady, but the tension thickened. The kind of tension that comes before revelation, before change. And they had no idea what was coming next. It was just one email, but it had enough poison to choke a kingdom. It started with a forgotten folder. Zephyra had grown used to digital clutter. Most high-level firms did a poor job of keeping their systems clean, relying on back-end filters and surface-level access protocols to hide their mess. But when systems are built to keep people out, they almost always leave blind spots for those bold enough to dig. And Zephyra was more than bold. She was methodical. It was a routine morning, or so it seemed. She'd arrived early, again, not to prove anything to anyone, but because early hours offered silence, the kind that lets you hear what's usually hidden. The office was still humming with pre-meeting buzz, assistants buzzing around, printers whirring, and someone's laugh bouncing off the marble floors like entitlement dressed in cologne. She wasn't in her usual cubicle that day. She had been temporarily relocated to an unoccupied team lead's desk while renovations happened in her department's corner of the floor. The system login was clean, but the synced drive hadn't yet been reset. On a hunch, she searched for non-indexed files, the kind that weren't searchable by tags or keywords, obsolete folders, buried chains, digital ghosts. That's when she saw it. Folder name, Legacy Adjustments Q3. Subfolder, External Messaging Compliance Notes, Drafts, and inside it, a single email thread, titled Managing New Assets, DEI versus ROI. Her finger hovered over the trackpad for only a second. Then she clicked. The thread dated back 7 months, right before her recruitment had been formalized. 4 correspondents, all senior. Names she recognized instantly: Travis Calhoun, Elliot Langford, Nicole Burnson, a man named Raymond Deek, who worked off-site as an optics consultant. The title alone made her skin crawl. The first email was blunt, sterile, and surgical in tone. Zephyra O'Neal is a smart hire, no doubt, but long-term viability for executive placement is a concern. We should structure her onboarding in a way that keeps our hands clean and our messaging progressive. Diversity plays well, but let's not set precedents that will be hard to unwind. The next reply built on it. Suggest we place her in a rotational track under soft leadership. Low-friction teams. HR can coach her through feedback integration, i.e. tone, attitude, fit. We present the mentorship angle heavily. We don't promise leadership. We highlight potential. Zephyra kept scrolling, her chest tightening, every sentence slicing through whatever remnants of naivety she had left. Then came the kicker, an email that turned her stillness into rage. Should be noted, her father is a minor stakeholder, but not disruptive. Shaq's presence is useful for public strategy, but his daughter's ambition could compromise stability. Recommend we monitor her for signals of upward expectation and act before narratives form. If needed, position any exit as a pivot toward independent leadership, framed with empowerment language. Soft landing. The final reply was one line. It chilled her blood. Let's call it what it is. DEI is optics. ROI is legacy. Handle her gracefully. She closed the thread slowly, fingers shaking, eyes burning. But her face was unreadable. She knew that whatever emotions she allowed in that moment could control her next move. And if there was anything she couldn't afford, it was to lose control. She didn't tell Shaq. Not yet. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she needed time. Time to understand how deep the rot went. Time to pull more strings, tug more threads. Her father's instincts were right. Something inside Virexian was broken. But this wasn't just about being passed over or underestimated. This was orchestration. A design sabotage hidden beneath diversity statements and photo shoots. And now she had proof. But with proof comes responsibility and risk. That night she printed the email thread, not to expose it immediately, but to preserve it offline. She slid the printouts into a leather folder and locked them in her home filing cabinet, right between her mother's old tax returns and her own grad school thesis, buried in plain sight. The next day at the office, nothing had changed, on the surface. Travis Calhoun greeted her with his usual performative grin, asked her if she'd caught the latest investor call. She nodded, pretending interest, pretending normalcy, because the key to exposing power was not in disrupting it loudly, but in outliving it strategically. That morning, she was scheduled to present on a new market growth initiative. She delivered the entire deck flawlessly. Numbers tight, future projections visionary, competitive analysis crisp. She even referenced a few internal gaps that she knew now had been manufactured by board decisions rooted in exclusion. As she finished, Nicole Burnson smiled and said, "That was great, Zephyra. It's good to see you settling in." Settling in. The phrase echoed in her mind, like a slap wearing pearls. The meeting ended. She packed her notes calmly, every move deliberate. No fury, no panic, only calculation. She left the boardroom with her head high, heels striking the tile like a clock ticking closer to reckoning. But trust that started to fracture. Back at home, Shaq noticed the shift. His daughter still texted him, still called, still sent jokes late at night. But there was a guardedness in her tone, a delay in her laughter, a sense that something was circling her energy like vultures waiting for weakness. He asked her outright one evening. They were on FaceTime. He'd made ribs and was showing off the plate. She didn't comment, just smiled politely. He tilted his head, narrowed his eyes. "You good, Z?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Just tired. Work's been extra lately." He didn't push, but the silence after her reply said more than she knew. Zephyra spent the next 2 weeks gathering pieces, a copied audit file from HR systems showing early feedback assessments, all color-coded, all with obvious disparities between white and non-white hires. A Slack transcript showing a conversation about cultural fit that echoed with every euphemism for "not one of us." A spreadsheet draft titled Retention Review Risk List that had her name bolded in red. She built a dossier. Not to blackmail, not to destroy, but to expose, to reveal, to document the lie dressed in a logo. She also began tracking interactions with Langford. During a networking brunch, she noticed him pull aside a younger executive and gesture toward her while whispering. The man approached her moments later, asked her if she'd consider leading a community-facing initiative focused on startup mentorship, the kind of role with no actual authority, but a lot of visibility. She smiled and asked, "Will I be reporting to anyone?" He fumbled. "Well, the role's more ambassadorial." She said she'd consider it. She never did. Back in her apartment, she opened a new file on her hard drive and titled it, Case Study, Controlled Inclusion in High Capital Environments, a technical name for what was about to become the most dangerous document in the company. Because the truth, when structured properly, becomes unstoppable. And all it takes is one match to ignite a legacy of gaslight. Shaq still hadn't seen the emails, but he could feel it, like the low rumble before an earthquake. His daughter's voice had changed. She wasn't asking for advice. She was positioning, planning. The calm before the rupture. Zephyra stood at her window that evening, watching the city blur beneath the rain. She didn't feel betrayed. She felt confirmed. Validated in the worst way. Because part of her had always known, this world was never going to hand her a seat unless it was nailed to the floor, legs short, voice muzzled. But they made one mistake. They thought she wouldn't find the blueprint. She had, and now she was drawing her own. They laughed with red wine teeth, but she counted every insult like bullets in a chamber. The invitation arrived in a white linen envelope, embossed with a gold seal that tried too hard to feel exclusive. Berexing Annual Innovators Circle Evening of Visionaries. It sounded impressive, important, essential. Zephyra understood immediately what it really was. Theater. A curated night where power dressed up as progress and diversity was staged as background harmony. But she said yes. Not because she wanted to attend, because she wanted to see the cast up close. The event was held at a private estate in the Bel Air Hills, glass and stone stacked like ambition with a valet line that ran half a block long. Guests arrived in quiet Teslas and roaring Aston Martins, hugged and air-kissed beneath a chandelier the size of a minivan. The theme was Futures Forged in Innovation. Zephyra arrived in a black tailored pantsuit with a neck brooch shaped like a phoenix. No sparkle, just edge. She checked in at the front and was handed a name card, not a place card. A subtle difference that became glaring once she reached the main hall. There were 3 long dinner tables under glass ceilings glowing with artificial starlight. Executives from across industries, tech, venture capital, biotech, political consulting, sat clustered together, laughing as wine flowed like honesty without consequences. Zephyra scanned the seating board and found her name, Table 3, near the back, next to a senior associate from marketing and someone labeled Tech Fellow, Gen Z Outreach. Her eyes narrowed. She walked over, slipped into her seat, nodded politely to the 2 guests beside her, and watched. That's what this night was for, watching. At the head of the room, Elliot Langford held court in a double-breasted blazer the color of debt. He moved from group to group with the confidence of a man convinced the system adored him because it did. Near him was Nicole Burnson, already tipsy, laughing too hard at something an oil lobbyist had said. A few tables down, Travis Calhoun was pointing toward Zephyra's direction. She didn't know what was being said, but she didn't have to hear it. She'd learned how to read mouths and posture and disdain camouflaged as curiosity. The server poured her wine with robotic grace. "Cabernet, miss?" She nodded but didn't drink. Not yet. As the main course was served, lamb over roasted pear, and something else designed more for art than appetite, conversations flowed louder. That's when it happened. One of the Virexion execs, a silver-haired man named Hunter Glass, turned toward their table during a lull in the conversation. He raised his glass. "To Big Shaq," he said, as if it were a joke they were all in on. "You raised a good one, assuming she's not just here to fact-check your investor pitch, huh?" Laughter, tight, half-aware. Zephyra smiled, slow and precise, then locked eyes with him. "I'm here as a representative of systems your generation never learned how to build without excluding us," she said. "You can toast to that too if you'd like." Silence dropped like a plate breaking on marble. Hunter's smile twitched. He turned back to his glass. The woman beside Zephyra, the tech fellow, exhaled through her nose, impressed but clearly not ready to align herself. Zephyra didn't need allies. She needed clarity. She stood and walked toward the bar at the corner of the room. Behind her she heard someone mutter, "Well, she's not shy, huh?" And another voice respond, "That one came with knives." She smiled again, not because it was funny, but because every insult sharpened her outline. Every misread made her more visible to herself. At the bar, a junior VC named Roland Harper approached her, tall, polished, performing empathy like a script.
Hey, I just wanted to say, you handled that with real class. That's not always easy, especially in rooms like these.
She looked at him. "Rooms like what?" He paused, fumbled. "You know, pressure, spotlight, the expectations." "Whose expectations?" she asked. He backed off with a grin, raising his glass. "Respect." Respect. The word thrown around like spare change in these circles. She walked away without acknowledging it. The rest of the night spiraled in the same rhythm. Polite hostility, masked opportunities, and an open mic-style humility parade from executives looking to outdo each other in allyship. She sat through a panel conversation during dessert titled, "Equity, Profit, and Power, Can We Have It All?" moderated by a woman in diamonds who once wrote an op-ed blaming the education gap on cultural distractions. Zephyra's expression didn't shift, but her mind didn't rest. What she was watching wasn't just a dinner. It was a corporate surveillance ritual, testing who would bend, who would perform, who would correct themselves mid-sentence to remain palatable. She noticed who got invited to the after-dinner cigar lounge, who was told, "You should talk to Elliot," and who was handed a gift bag and a silent exit. Around 11:30, just as people began peeling off into side rooms and wine was replaced by scotch, Zephyra stepped outside to the edge of the patio. Below her, the Los Angeles basin blinked in quiet code, a city alive with decisions that rarely included people like her. She took out her phone and opened her notes. Asset repositioning language. Token rotations. Behavior coaching for tone. She wasn't angry. She was building. Because while they thought this dinner would be another night to test her patience, what they didn't see was that she had come with an agenda of her own. She wasn't here to network. She was here to confirm what she already suspected. They had no plan to ever truly let her rise. And that meant she had every reason to burn the floor. Not with fire, but with facts. With data. With exposure. Behind her, someone called her name. It was Nicole Burnson. Red-faced from wine. "Hey, I just realized we never got to talk. I've been meaning to ask if you'd consider joining our Diversity Outcomes Council. It's a really great way to get visibility." Zephyra turned, her voice cool. "Visibility's what you offer when you've already decided not to give someone power." Nicole blinked. I didn't mean it that way." "But that's what you said." Nicole stammered. "We're trying, Zephyra. These things take time." Zephyra nodded once. "Time's up." She turned and walked past the koi pond, through the garden gate, down the path that led to the waiting valet. She didn't wait for her car. She didn't wait for permission. Inside her clutch was a flash drive containing all the email threads she had compiled, cross-referenced and duplicated. She wasn't done. She was just beginning. And this dinner, this polished pageant of soft prejudice and strategic posturing, this was the last time she would walk into a room they controlled, without making sure the foundation cracked beneath them. They wouldn't forget this night. In 10 minutes, everything changed. The air thickened. The balance of power cracked. It was supposed to be routine. A closed-door quarterly session with high-level shareholders and board advisors. meant to finalize Virexian's upcoming fiscal plan. No press, no assistance, just curated numbers, choreographed strategy, and champagne promises for the quarter ahead. Zephyra had no seat at the table. Officially, but unofficially, she had been asked to observe, a gesture meant to appear inclusive while making sure she remained silent, invisible. She stood near the glass wall at the edge of the conference suite, holding a legal pad more out of performance than need. She had already memorized the figures, dissected the projections, and noted every discrepancy from the prep deck. The room was tense from the start. Shareholder stress had mounted after a competitor announced a disruptive AI integration that put Virexian's current roadmap in jeopardy. The pressure was on the CEO, Douglas Clay, a man known for crisp diction, hardline posture, and the smug patience of someone rarely challenged. He opened the meeting with his usual measured tone, but Zephyra noticed it immediately. His voice was thinner. His skin was pale beneath his tan. Something about the way he gripped the table edge before speaking. The first 10 minutes were procedural. Numbers were cited, slides clicked through. But when he stepped away from the podium to address a strategic question on international partnerships, his hand twitched. Then his jaw. Then his legs buckled. It happened fast, too fast for anyone to pretend otherwise. One moment he was upright, voice sharp. The next he collapsed like a tower whose core had suddenly gone hollow. Chaos scattered across the table like glass. 2 board members rushed toward him. Another fumbled for a phone, barking for medical assistance. Nicole Burnson stood frozen, mouth open but speechless. Langford, ever the tactician, stepped back rather than forward, eyes darting toward the room's side exit. Zephyra didn't move at first. She watched, not because she didn't care, but because she'd been in rooms like this before, where confusion was currency, where people flailed not from care, but from fear of looking useless, and that's when she did something no one expected. She stepped forward, not to the fallen CEO, but to the touchscreen display still open to the quarterly report. She tapped the console, pulled up the back-end dataset, and accessed the full financial outline, one she knew inside out. "This report is incomplete," she said, voice steady as the medical team burst through the door. "The AI compliance impact ratios aren't aligned with updated market conditions, and we're over-projecting international user growth based on 2022 pre-regulatory curves." The board paused, some in shock, others unsure if they'd heard her right. Zephyra kept going. "If we proceed with these estimates, investor confidence will drop sharply. We need to move the presentation into contingency modeling now. Slide 14 has the structure. Resync it with real-time analytics and prep the B plan for vote." It was clinical, direct, and exactly what the room needed. One of the junior partners, the kind who always stayed quiet unless backed by consensus, blinked at her. "Do you have access credentials?" "I don't need credentials," she replied. "I built this model in shadow testing 2 months ago. The framework's still housed in internal sandbox servers. If someone can connect me, I'll drive the demo." Silence twisted into stunned permission. A tech liaison offered his tablet. She took it, connected to the secure data feed, and pulled up an alternate dashboard. Within 3 minutes, she had the floor. And within 10, she'd rewritten the entire tempo of the meeting. The paramedics lifted the CEO onto a stretcher. He was conscious, barely, but unable to speak. No one moved to replace him. Everyone simply turned to the woman who had seized control not with authority, but with calm, precise power. By minute 11, she was outlining projected loss prevention strategies for Q3 and renegotiation tactics for supplier partnerships. By minute 13, Langford raised a hand. "That's enough." Zephyra looked at him. She didn't flinch. "I think," he said, smoothing his blazer, "we've heard quite a bit from an unconfirmed source. Perhaps we take a break." But no one else echoed him. Not one. Instead, a senior investor stood. "I want her on the contingency task force. Immediately." Another voice. Then another. Zephyra nodded once and returned the tablet to the tech rep. She didn't argue. She didn't gloat. She stepped back, exactly as she'd entered. Calm, composed, unshaken. Later that evening, back in her apartment, she didn't celebrate. She sat alone with a single light on, replaying every move she made, every glance, every calculation. Because while she had gained visibility, it wasn't all admiration. The glances she received at the end of that meeting weren't just impressed, they were wary. Some skeptical, a few deeply threatened. They weren't sure if they'd seen leadership rise or rebellion start to form. She didn't care. She hadn't acted to impress. She had acted because the room was broken, and she knew how to fix it. The fact that it took a medical emergency for them to listen wasn't lost on her, but now they had. and now she was in their line of sight. Shaq called that night. He had heard. "I heard you lit the room on fire." She smirked. "Not fire, just light." "You okay?" "Yes." Pause. "You ready for the pushback?"
I was born in it.
He was silent for a second, then added, "Just watch your shadow. That's where they hide." The next morning, as the internal Virexion newsletter circulated updates about the CEO's health and hinted at unforeseen leadership pivots, Zephyra's name appeared for the first time in print, a standout analyst with key foresight contributions during an emergency response. It was a compliment and a warning, because buried in the wording was the implication that she'd stepped out of line, that her brilliance was situational, that now she'd have to prove it wasn't a one-time stroke. But Zephyra didn't need applause. She needed access. And now, the door was cracked, just wide enough to pull something big through. His smile had made billions. Now his silence was being sold. For most of his life, Shaquille O'Neal's presence in a room had been enough to change the tone. His height demanded attention. His voice carried authority. His legacy, carved into basketball courts and stitched into corporate portfolios, gave him a seat at nearly any table he chose. But lately, he'd started to feel it, the subtle shift in how those rooms looked at him. Not as the architect, not even as the partner, as the brand. The safe, familiar symbol, the big man with the bigger smile. A corporate talisman that let boardrooms pat themselves on the back while burying their bias beneath branded philanthropy. He didn't talk about it, not publicly, not even often in private, but he noticed the way investors mentioned his charity work more than his business instincts, the way his presence was requested for photo moments, not strategy sessions, and the way Elliot Langford always included him just enough to claim alignment, never enough to give him leverage. But all of that was theory, feeling, until facts made it personal. It was a Wednesday, the kind of day where nothing should happen but emails and water cooler pleasantries. Zephyra had requested a private meeting with him at his Atlanta home. No pretext, no humor in her tone. He knew something was off the moment she walked in. No laptop bag, no heels, just sneakers, a backpack, and that fire behind the eyes look he hadn't seen since she was 16, and found out a teacher docked her grade because her argument was too aggressive. They sat at the kitchen island, silence stretching longer than usual. She opened the backpack and slid out a red folder. Inside were 4 printed documents, stapled and highlighted. She didn't speak. She just handed them over. Shaq read slowly. Then he read again. The words didn't shout, but they cut deep. Internal communication logs, meeting minutes, a transaction summary, and a closed-door memo outlining the firm's decision to halt a merger with a rising tech accelerator focused on underrepresented founders. The justification read as sanitized strategy, brand misalignment, low profit scalability, need for cultural consistency. But then came the sentence that made his chest hollow out. Shaquille O'Neal's standing as an equity ambassador will be leveraged to affirm non-participation. Public statement optional, board pushback unlikely. His name, used as a shield. Without his knowledge, without consent, to kill something he would have supported without hesitation. He looked up, eyes hardening. When? Zephyra didn't flinch. 6 weeks ago, before the last quarterly review, Langford orchestrated it, told legal your stance was aligned based on a call that never happened. They signed off without consulting you. Shaq stood up slowly, pushed his stool back with a low scrape. He walked to the sink, braced both hands on the counter. Not angry, focused. The kind of silence that comes when someone has spent years being gracious and finally sees what was built on the back of that grace. "They're using me," he said finally. "They've been using you," Zephyra replied. "This time, they put it in writing." He turned back around. "And they're betting I won't say anything. Because you're the friendly giant, the ambassador, they think you won't get messy." His mouth twitched, just slightly. "They forgot where I came from." The merger that had been blocked wasn't just any startup deal. It was a joint initiative led by 3 Black founders in Detroit, one of whom Shaq had personally mentored through a youth scholarship program years ago. Their project was aimed at bridging tech education access through smart infrastructure, real innovation, not just branding fluff. And Virexion had ghosted them, then quietly framed it as philosophical misalignment, leaning on Shaq's supposed disapproval to ease the fallout. Zephyra pulled out her tablet and slid it across the table. "There's more. I dug through secondary meeting logs. This isn't the first time your name's been used to whitewash a decision. Remember that Harlem incubator you supported last year? They cited your concerns about urban brand dilution when they pulled funding from the follow-up program."
I never said that.
"I know." Shaq exhaled slowly. The betrayal wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It sat in his chest like weight added slowly, deliberately. One assumption at a time. One photo op at a time. One smile at a time. Until he wasn't seen as a person anymore. Just a convenient projection. His silence had made them comfortable. Now it was costing people real opportunities. Zephyra leaned forward. This is why I didn't tell you earlier. I needed to be sure. I needed to trace it all. You were sure the day you found the email, he said, narrowing his eyes. She didn't deny it. I needed to be ready to defend it, with no room for denial. He nodded. Respect. Then he asked the only question that mattered. Now, what's the move? She slid another document forward. A summary memo, drafted by her formal tone, precise language, legally sound. It outlined the misuse of stakeholder identity, the implication of intentional misrepresentation, and the potential legal exposure if made public. She had watermarked it. Internal review brief, confidential stakeholder flag. I've already sent a redacted version to internal compliance, she said. No noise yet, but they'll feel the tremor, and if we escalate to shareholders or worse, media, this becomes radioactive. Shaq read the memo again. Then he looked at his daughter, and something shifted in his expression. A mix of pride and sorrow. Pride that she'd grown into a tactician beyond what he imagined. Sorrow that she'd had to... You know, he said, they always loved that I smiled, that I laughed, that I was easy, but I built half this company's investor trust with my name, my money. I know. He paused. So let's make them regret underestimating it. Zephyra smiled. Not wide, just enough. The next day, Shaq requested an executive-only meeting with Langford and 2 senior board members. He didn't announce it. He didn't send an agenda. He walked in wearing a dark gray suit and a stare that offered no warmth. He handed them the same memo Zephyra had drafted. Sat across from them without touching his coffee. Let them read in silence. Langford looked up first, a faint sheen of sweat forming near his temple. Shaquille, I can explain. You should save that for compliance, he cut in. Langford tried again. This is all a misunderstanding. No, Shaq interrupted again, voice low and steady. Misunderstanding is when you say the wrong name on a group email. Misunderstanding is a scheduling error. This, he tapped the memo, is theft of my name, of my credibility, and of people's futures. Langford swallowed. Shaq stood. I'm giving you 48 hours to issue a retraction to the accelerator founders. Full acknowledgement. Public statement. I'll be reading it live at the Equity and Capital Conference next week. He paused. If it's not ready by then, I'll write my own. No one in the room challenged him. They couldn't, not anymore. Because they hadn't just underestimated the legend. They'd tried to sell his silence. And now they'd have to pay for the noise. Lucille O'Neal had seen too many kings crowned and beheaded in a single breath. Lucille O'Neal never raised her voice unless she was talking to God or correcting history. She was a tall woman with a preacher's stillness and a schoolteacher's eyes, sharp, tired of excuses, but merciful when it mattered. Shaq often said he got his strength from her, but what he didn't say, and what Zephyra now understood, was that the real inheritance wasn't strength, it was endurance, a wisdom earned in shadows, passed down not in speeches, but in glances and warnings. It was Sunday, 3 days after Shaq's quiet confrontation with Langford, when Zephyra arrived at her grandmother's house, not Shaq's mansion, not a boardroom, but a one-story brick home in Newark with rust-colored shutters, the same prayer books by the window, and the same framed Bible verse over the mantel. No weapon formed against thee shall prosper. Lucille answered the door with a dish towel in one hand and a question in her eyes. Zephyra hugged her, long and quiet. It had been months. Inside, the air smelled like cornbread and something deeper, legacy. Lucille poured sweet tea without asking and sat across from her granddaughter, folding her hands like she already knew the story and was waiting to see how it would be told. They think I'm a symbol, Zephyra said. An image they can polish, use, replace when I stop playing along. Lucille didn't flinch. She let the silence grow roots. Zephyra sipped the tea and continued. They smile while they shut doors. They compliment while they undermine. They act like every room I walk into is a gift I didn't earn. Lucille nodded slowly. And what have you done? Zephyra leaned back. Everything but burn the place down. Lucille tilted her head. Good. Because fire is only holy when it's controlled. Let it loose too early, and all you got left is ashes and regrets. Zephyra chuckled under her breath. You're saying play their game? No, Lucille said, steady. I'm saying know their game, and never let them convince you it's the only one. She stood, walked over to the fireplace, and pulled a small wooden box from beneath the mantel. Inside were newspaper clippings, old photos, and yellowed pages from journals worn by time and struggle. She placed them on the table. "Your daddy's not the first in this family to be used," she said, "and you're not the first to be underestimated." Zephyra picked up one of the clippings, a black and white photo of Lucille in her 20s, being escorted off a college campus in handcuffs. The headline read, "Student Protester Disrupts Speaker Series on Urban Reform." "You were arrested?" Lucille smiled, faint and dry. "Twice. First time for speaking out when they cut funding to black student housing. Second time for organizing a sit-in, when they let a known segregationist give a keynote. No one ever told me. No one ever asked." Zephyra sat with that truth for a long moment. Lucille continued, "They want your fire to burn out, not to light the way. They'll praise your poise but punish your clarity. They'll hire you for your voice, then ask you to whisper. It's not new, but the playbook changes faces." Zephyra stared at the clippings, flipping through the silent legacy. It wasn't rage she felt. It wasn't fear either. It was a clarity sharper than anything she'd felt in weeks. Lucille saw it on her face. "You've been building something," she said. Zephyra nodded. "More than they know. You planning to use it?" "When the timing's right." Lucille leaned back and took a long sip of tea. "Then let me show you what timing looks like." She reached into the wooden box again and pulled out a worn leather-bound notebook. Inside were diagrams, timelines, maps of social connections, not from corporations, but from churches, unions, education boards, grassroots organizations. Lucille had kept track of every betrayal, every turning tide, every opportunity missed, and every moment seized. "This is how we survived," she said, "and this is how you win." Zephyra flipped through the pages, not ancient, not dusty, but pulsing with relevance. Her grandmother had done more than pray. She had strategized. She had mapped out systems before the word networking became corporate jargon, and she had taught herself where pressure could be applied without shouting, how change was made in silence before it echoed out loud. Later, they moved to the porch. The sky above them hung low, purple with dusk, as if listening in. Lucille looked out across the yard. "Your father is fire and earth," she said. "He builds, he stands. But even he forgets sometimes that empires can rot from within. He trusts too much." "I know," Zephyra said. "And you?" "I don't trust. I verify." Lucille smiled. "Good. Just remember, don't lose yourself trying to be invincible. You don't have to win every room, just the right ones." They sat for a long time after that. No talk of meetings, no corporate jargon, just space, breath, legacy passed not in speeches, but in memory. When Zephyra left that night, she took the leather notebook with her. Lucille had offered it without hesitation. "It's yours now," she said. "Make sure you add to it." And she would. Because now Zephyra wasn't just reacting. She wasn't just gathering proof or waiting for another insult to crystallize her purpose. Now she had a blueprint. Not for revenge, but for reconstruction. Because Lucille hadn't raised her to survive the fire. She had raised her to become it. The walls had no windows, but everyone was exposed. The boardroom was designed to impress, but not to feel. Polished steel edges, deep oak tables, frosted glass that turned opaque at the flick of a remote. A place built for illusions of transparency. But today, none of that mattered, because what Zephyra O'Neal was about to do wasn't about appearance. It was about exposure. At 9 a.m. sharp, the senior board members of Virexion Technologies filed into the room, their faces composed, postures neutral. They didn't know exactly why they were there, but they knew enough to feel uneasy. The last 2 weeks had been riddled with quiet tremors, redirected emails, missing reports, unexplained meeting reschedules. And now, this. A closed-door emergency session called by the chair of internal ethics, the legal counsel, and Zephyra O'Neal. She wasn't on the board. Not yet. But after this meeting, she would either be voted in or shut out for good. Shaq arrived last, walking in like a statue with momentum. He took his seat without ceremony, nodding once towards Zephyra, who stood already at the end of the table, laptop open, folders stacked, a single black binder resting on top like a detonator. No slides, no presentation software, just receipts. Zephyra began, her tone composed but carved with edge. "We're not here today to discuss the company's next quarter. We're here to determine whether it deserves one." There were minor shifts in the chairs, but no one spoke. She opened the binder. "I've assembled documentation from internal audits, email chains, human resources analytics, and partner program withdrawals, all pointing to a systemic suppression of diversity initiatives and a coordinated strategy to tokenize minority presence while maintaining legacy control. She began with the data. Cold, unbiased, brutal. A 61% drop in internal promotions for candidates of color over a 4-year period, masked by lateral moves dressed up as developmental rotations. A 47% increase in marketing budget for DEI optics, while only 9% of actual funding reached internal employee programs. Termination rates for black employees in tech roles, 2.3x higher than the white average. Zephyra clicked the remote, and the wall screen came alive, not with charts but with muted videos. Clips from whistleblower testimonies, blurred faces, altered voices, a senior recruiter describing a directive to avoid candidates that might trigger internal culture risk. A project manager confessing that entire product teams were disbanded after being too vocal about representation. Gasps rippled across the table. Langford adjusted his tie. "I'm not done," Zephyra said, flipping another page. She pulled out an internal memo, date-stamped 6 months ago, in which a proposal for minority-led innovation labs was rejected with the note, "Too soon. Could destabilize optics if failure occurs." Then came the final file. The one that silenced even Nicole Bernson's fidgeting. It was an audio clip. Langford's voice. "We let them win too fast. They think they own the place. Just let her cycle out. No need to promote. She'll leave when she gets bored." No one blinked. No one breathed. Zephyra paused. Let the silence choke the air the same way they had tried to choke her out of the system. Then she spoke again. "You didn't just try to block equity. You built a culture that sabotages brilliance when it doesn't look like you. And now that brilliance is calling for accountability." Langford leaned forward, jaw clenched. "Are we really entertaining an unsanctioned hearing led by someone who isn't even part of this board?" Shaq cut in, calm, cold. "She will be. Today." That's when the legal counsel stood. A white-haired woman named Ruth Delano, respected, neutral, clinical. "The shareholders have reviewed the submitted evidence. Given the severity of the internal findings and potential reputational damage, an emergency vote has been called. Proposal: install interim CEO for 90 days while formal inquiries are completed." Zephyra's name was already on the ballot. Langford protested. "This is absurd. We have structure, procedure." Ruth raised a brow. "And that structure has been leveraged to protect unethical behavior. You don't get to cry protocol now." Zephyra remained still. No smile, no performance, just presence. The vote was scheduled for the end of the session. The room shifted into chaos disguised as order, questions, bluster, legal positioning, whispered huddles near the window. But beneath it all, a new current pulsed, one of fear, not of her, but of what she represented. Because Zephyra hadn't come in with a demand. She'd come in with a mirror. And the room didn't like what it saw. Shaq leaned in beside her, as the board members moved to the far end to deliberate. "You ready for this?" Zephyra nodded. "Are they?" But even as they stood side by side, the fire in the foundation, something slid loose in the air. A feeling. Wrongness. Back in her office later that evening, Zephyra opened her inbox to review post-vote documentation drafts. The decision was set to be emailed to stakeholders within 48 hours. The votes were to be confidential until then. But there was a message, one she hadn't expected. From someone she trusted. Subject line: "Sorry." It was from Dane Keller, the in-house policy strategist she'd worked with quietly over the last year. He had been the one to help her cross-check the data, to scrub the code that buried internal feedback. A behind-the-scenes ally, someone she never doubted. The email was short. "They got to me. They threatened exposure, family stuff. I flipped my vote. You're not safe. Watch the numbers. Watch Langford." Her hands went cold. Not because of the betrayal. Because of the timing. She flipped open the draft ballot report Ruth had left open access. 10 board members. 6 required to pass. She had 5. Dane had been the 6th. And now she was 1 short. The walls may have no windows. But someone had found a back door. Zephyra sat back in her chair, closed her laptop, and let the room settle into silence. She had exposed the rot. But now the termites were moving faster. It wasn't the ride up that shook her. It was who stood beside her, pressing the emergency stop. The elevator rose with its usual mechanical grace, a silent ride up 32 floors in Virexion's executive wing. Zephyra stood with her arms folded, not because she was cold, but because stillness kept her centered. She had just come from a meeting with the internal ethics panel. After everything she'd exposed in the boardroom, She was close, too close to being officially voted in as interim CEO. Her face was calm, her hands steady, but inside, something throbbed. A tension that had nothing to do with the vote count, and everything to do with the wrongness she hadn't been able to shake since Dane's message. Something about the air in the building felt heavier lately. And that weight, it had a face. Standing next to her in the elevator was Kendrick Lowe, her executive assistant, hired 6 months earlier. He had come highly recommended, polished, discreet, brilliant with logistics, and until now, deeply loyal. He handled her schedule, her security clearances, coordinated her shadow meetings, and vetted her press inquiries. He was also the one who had insisted on this meeting upstairs, said the general counsel had left a file out that needed to be reviewed before it hit the stakeholder release. Now as the elevator hummed past floor 26, Kendrick didn't look at her. Not once. Then, somewhere between floor 28 and 29, his hand moved. He reached over and pressed the red emergency stop button. The car jolted to a halt. She didn't flinch, but she turned, slowly. Kendrick. Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. He didn't meet her eyes. I didn't want them to be the ones to tell you. What are you talking about? He exhaled, finally looking at her. And it was all there. Regret, fear, shame. I leaked something. Her stomach didn't drop. Her pulse didn't spike. She was too used to betrayal by now for it to feel like a surprise. What did you leak? A memo. You never signed it. A draft proposal from 6 months ago about leadership restructuring and diversity backlash mitigation. You wrote it as a thought exercise, internal only. It got spun. Spun how? They're framing it like a manifesto. Like you were planning to remove entire divisions of white executives. Like you called the current board a plantation council. She didn't blink. I never wrote that phrase. I know, but I let it out before verifying the version. It's been altered. It's on 3 media blogs already. Anonymous tip. All traced back to my ID. Now her chest did tighten.
Why, Kendrick?
He hesitated. Then he said it. Eldon Bishop. The name hit like a crack of thunder. The ex-CEO of Virexion, ousted 5 years ago for internal misconduct, now living in quiet luxury with stock options and a portfolio of back-channel influence. He had disappeared from headlines, but not from boardrooms. He approached me 2 months ago, Kendrick said. Said he wanted eyes on you. Offered 6 figures, said the company wouldn't survive another radical appointment, and that Langford was working behind the scenes to reinstate him. Zephyra stepped forward. You took the money? He swallowed. I thought I could manage it. Just listen. Feedback, nothing real. But then after the board vote, everything changed. They were going to lose. You were going to win. So they needed something fast. And you gave it to them. I didn't mean to. You did. Silence pressed in like heat. Then Kendrick added, voice cracking. I didn't think they'd twist it. I thought I could control the narrative. She shook her head. You thought you were in charge of the storm. You forgot I am the storm. His face crumpled slightly. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't unspin a narrative. She stepped back and hit the button again. The elevator resumed its slow ascent. He didn't speak again. Neither did she. When the doors opened, she walked out first. Not fast, not storming, just deliberate. By the time she reached her office, her phone was already vibrating with alerts. 3 emails, 1 press inquiry, a trending hashtag, Radical Zephyra. A BuzzFeed-style blog had published an anonymous leak of the memo, edited and dramatized with pull quotes highlighted in bold. Systemic overhaul required to reverse boardroom imbalance. White leaders must be re-evaluated in context of legacy power hoarding. Except Zephyra had never written those words. Not like that. The bones of the memo were hers. A speculative draft she'd written during her policy research phase. A study in how companies react when true equity challenges comfort, but it had been taken out of context, amplified, and laced with incendiary edits. The headlines followed quickly. Too young, too radical. O'Neal's daughter calls for whiteboard cleansing. Legacy or liability. She sat down at her desk, breathing slowly through her nose. Her mind began to spin, not in panic, but in architecture. Damage control wasn't an option. This wasn't just a leak. It was a setup. A maneuver from someone who had power once, and saw her as the wall between them and their return. She dialed Shaq. He picked up on the second ring. I know, he said before she spoke. You saw it? Whole cities watching it burn. There was silence. Then he said, what do you need? Clarity and distance. You stepping back? No, she said, voice hardening. I'm stepping forward. but I'm not letting them pull me into a fire they lit. She called a press strategist, one trusted, one who knew how to navigate smear campaigns without bending to outrage culture. Then she called the ethics chair, requested a freeze on the vote, pending a formal review of the leak. The truth would come out, eventually. But perception was already spinning, and perception in boardrooms and headlines always outran fact. The board would see her now as risky, dangerous, untamed, which meant she had to make them fear irrelevance more than they feared her. By the next morning, her office issued a formal statement. The document in question is an unauthorized manipulation of an internal draft. Ms. O'Neal remains committed to data-driven reform, not personal agendas. Those attempting to weaponize misrepresentation will be addressed through legal and structural channels. It wasn't emotional, it was surgical. But the damage still stained. Langford used the moment, quietly, subtly. He postponed the vote, citing optics. Shaq called again that night. "You want me to go public?" "Not yet," Zephyra replied. "Let them think I'm backing off. Let them exhale." "Then what?" She smiled. A smile with no joy in it, just precision. "Then we make the next move, before they know the board's already flipped." Because while they were scrambling to repair the narrative, she had already rewritten the ending. Sometimes you don't kick down the door, you build a better one beside it and open it wide. The ballroom at the downtown LA Westlight Center hadn't seen a crowd like this since the IPO of Virexian's flagship product 5 years ago. This time, it wasn't tech reporters or venture capitalists filling the rows. It was tension. Flashes from press cameras cut through the chandelier light like warnings. Something was coming. They could feel it. Shaquille O'Neal stood behind the podium. Not smiling. Not softening. Not performing. His custom gray suit fit like steel. The only thing sharper was the silence waiting for his voice. "I've stood behind this company for almost a decade," he began, voice low and steady. "But today I'm not standing behind it. I'm standing in front of something new." Reporters leaned forward. In recent weeks, misinformation and manipulation have been used to discredit the integrity and vision of one of the most capable leaders I've ever known, my daughter Zephyra O'Neal. A collective intake of breath moved through the room like a tide shifting beneath glass. Shaq didn't blink. Let me be clear, Virexian didn't build her. She was already an architect. This firm has profited from her strategies, from her silence, and from her ability to fix the messes made by men too proud to say they got it wrong. He paused, then leaned forward slightly, both hands gripping the podium edge. This isn't about nepotism. This is about truth. Equity isn't a trend. It's overdue infrastructure. And if you think her ideas are too radical, maybe you're too comfortable with the broken. The audience erupted into a sea of hands and shouts, but Shaq raised his hand once, and it all fell silent. "I'm not asking. I'm naming her. Zephyra O'Neal, my successor on this board, effective immediately. And if anyone here feels threatened by that, then you're finally starting to understand how change works." The clip aired within 20 minutes. It was all over the financial channels within an hour. The hashtags flipped. From Radical Zephyra to Build with Zephyra, voices that had hesitated days earlier began to speak louder. Shareholders began emailing. Staffers forwarded internal memos demanding transparency. But behind the public firestorm, something else was burning. Langford didn't respond publicly. He retreated. In quiet rooms, the old guard circled like sharks sniffing blood in the water. Not hers, theirs. Because what Shaq had done wasn't just defend Zephyra. He'd framed the vote as a referendum on the future, and now neutrality had become cowardice. Silence looked like guilt. Inside Virexian's West Tower, Zephyra sat with Ruth Delano, reviewing the finalized voting structure. The postponed vote had been rescheduled for the next morning. Board members were no longer anonymous. Their positions would be public. No shields, no shadows. "This won't be a landslide," Ruth said, flipping through the paper ballot summary. "But you don't need a landslide, you just need 6. Zephyra nodded. "I already have 5 confirmed." "And the 6th? Zephyra turned toward the glass wall and watched the city blink beneath a rising dusk. "I'm betting on someone who knows what survival really costs." That someone was Thomas Elridge, senior board member, son of a civil rights attorney, and until now neutral in every vote. Thomas had never picked sides. He floated above conflict like a weather vane in a storm. But neutrality, Zephyr knew, was just privilege in polished shoes. She met him that night in a private office tucked behind Virexian's media wing. No security, no assistants, just 2 chairs and one unspoken question. He poured water, not wine. "You've done your homework," he said quietly. You've laid out the case. Zephyra didn't nod. She didn't blink. I didn't come to convince you, she said. I came to remind you that when this vote is written into company history, you're either going to be the man who flinched or the one who helped turn the tide. Thomas looked down at his glass. They say you're too young. They said the same thing about your father. Silence. Then a smirk. I'll see you tomorrow. She left without saying another word. The next morning arrived fast and hard. The air in the conference wing buzzed with anticipation so dense it felt humid. The chairs were filled, the press was locked out. The table was long, 10 board members, 1 legal chair. No excuses. Ruth Delano opened the vote. We are here today to determine whether Zephyra O'Neal will be instated as interim CEO of Virexion Technologies for a 90-day executive cycle, pending full performance review and shareholder affirmation. One by one, the board members spoke. Nicole Burnson, yes. Travis Calhoun, no. Maria Keene, yes. Dane Keller, now pale and sweating, yes. Langford, with a tone thick with disdain, no. A tie at 3-2. Then came the final 5. One by one names, yeses, nos. At 5-4, all eyes turned to Thomas Elridge. He didn't look at Zephyra. He didn't look at Langford. He looked straight at Ruth and said one word, yes. The table didn't erupt. It didn't cheer. Because real change doesn't come with applause. It comes with quiet reckoning. Zephyra stood, spine straight, eyes calm. Ruth confirmed the result. As of this vote, Zephyra O'Neal is named interim CEO of Virexion Technologies, with immediate effect. This session is now closed. Langford stormed out. Others lingered, unsure whether to offer handshakes or make calls. Zephyra didn't wait. She walked out of the room, passed through the executive hallway, and stepped into the same elevator where betrayal once pressed pause on her ascent. This time, she pressed the top floor. No stops. No sabotage. No apologies. Sometimes you don't need to kick down the door. Sometimes you build a better one beside it. And walk right through. 10 minutes was all it took to go from serve it to own it. The door to the corner office opened with the soft hiss of compressed hinges. Not dramatic, not ceremonial. Just a quiet sound marking a moment so long overdue it felt more like correction than celebration. Zephyra stepped inside alone. No ribbon cutting, no camera crews, just sunlight pouring in through high-rise glass and the scent of new paint drying against freshly polished wood. And there, right in the center of her desk, was the same thing that had once defined her place in this building. A single coffee cup. White ceramic, stainless steel spoon resting neatly beside it. No note, no name, just steam still rising, as if time had curled in on itself and dared her to flinch. She didn't. Instead, she walked around the desk slowly, dragging her fingers across the edge like she was tracing every inch of resistance that had tried to keep her out of this space. She didn't sit down yet. She looked around first, taking inventory, not just of the furniture, but of the ghosts. Because there were ghosts in this room. Not of people, but of stories. Women who'd been shut down before they spoke up. Ideas dismissed before they ever had a prototype. Promotions redirected, talents minimized, identity sanitized. But Zephyra wasn't here to exorcise those ghosts. She was here to give them closure. She finally took her seat, leaning back into the leather chair that once turned its back on people like her. Her fingers hovered over the screen-embedded desktop console. Instead of checking her email, she opened a folder titled Blueprint. Inside, it was her first act as interim CEO, a 3-phase restructuring plan. Phase 1, personnel audit and reformation. Every executive was to submit a 3-year track record, not just of performance, but of people impact, whose ideas they'd greenlit, whose voices they'd amplified, whose careers they'd quietly strangled. There would be no mass firings, but there would be accountability. Executive bonuses would now be tied directly to equitable hiring metrics and long-term retention, not just growth margins. Phase 2, rebuilding the bridge. Virexion had bled talent for years, not because the industry moved too fast, but because leadership moved too slow. Zephyra launched a mentorship initiative that paired new recruits with actual power brokers, not diversity representatives. She called it the elevation track. It wasn't about checking boxes. It was about checking bias. Phase 3, the unfiltered table. She converted the firm's third-largest conference room into an open-floor forum held bi-weekly. Anyone in the company could request a seat, present a grievance or offer a vision. No ranks, no agendas, just voices. Her only rule? No one spoke twice until everyone had spoken once. The changes were swift. Some called them aggressive. She called them overdue. The first week brought praise and panic. Internal Slack channels lit up with cautious optimism and anonymous rage. News outlets offered split coverage. One called her the new blueprint for boardroom disruption, while another suggested she was creating fear-driven compliance masked as equity. She didn't respond to any of it. She let the work speak. By week 2, the legal department reported an uptick in whistleblower cooperation. People were finally speaking, because they finally believed someone was listening. HR reported more applications from diverse candidates in a single week than the last 3 months combined. Still, Langford wasn't quiet. Though publicly ousted, he remained a whispering shadow. He leveraged old allies, spread rumors about Zephyra's endgame, painted her as unstable, unseasoned, too emotional to manage pressure at scale. She responded with the kind of weapon he feared most: transparency. She published her full compensation structure, declining bonuses until structural diversity goals were met company-wide. She created a blind review panel for promotions. She personally signed off on a startup fund reserved exclusively for underrepresented founders. Her decisions weren't radical, they were rational. But in a system built on imbalance, fairness always looks like rebellion. 1 month in, during the first full board meeting under her leadership, the room sat unusually still. It was the same boardroom, same table, same frosted glass. But everything felt different. Because this time, everyone knew the rules had changed. Zephyra walked in precisely at 10 a.m. No fanfare, no entourage. She took her seat at the head of the table, placed her binder down gently, and scanned the room once, her gaze calm, unbothered. And then she said it. The same line she'd rehearsed in her head for weeks. The one that had lived inside her since that first humiliating moment. The one that now dripped not with vengeance, but with quiet, poetic justice. "Any coffee orders before we begin?" The room was silent. Not awkward, not hostile. Just aware. Aware of where she had started. Aware of how they had treated her. Aware of what she had become. No one spoke. Not even Travis Calhoun, who shifted in his chair like a man watching his own reflection blur. Zephyra gave them 3 seconds. Then opened her binder. "The agenda today includes the internal audit recommendations, the next stage of our startup investment funnel, and revisions to the board recruitment matrix." She didn't gloat. She didn't perform. She worked. By the end of the session, 3 senior advisors had volunteered to step back from their roles, citing self-assessed blind spots. 2 others requested inclusion training. And one, Nicole Burnson, walked up after the meeting and simply said,
You proved all of us wrong.
Zephyra smiled. Not wide, just honest.
I wasn't trying to.
Nicole hesitated. "I know." Later that afternoon, Zephyra returned to her office. The coffee cup was still there. Still untouched. Still hot. She didn't throw it away. She didn't drink it. She left it. A symbol. Not of where she came from, but of what she chose not to become. She could have built an empire out of retaliation, but she didn't. She rebuilt the one they thought she'd never enter, and did it with precision, grace, and fire cold enough to boil systems without burning the soil. Legacy wasn't about staying in power. It was about making sure others could reach it without shrinking themselves to fit. And Zephyra, she didn't just reach the top. She rewrote the map so no one like her would have to start in the basement again. Think the boardroom is where power lives? Think again. It's where it gets challenged. If Zephyra's rise lit a fire in you, stay close. The next story's already unfolding. This isn't just fiction. It's a mirror. And sometimes, mirrors crack under truth. Keep your eyes open. The next empire might be yours to rewrite.